Hello, everybody. Welcome to this last session today. I want to welcome the speakers of the last session, which are Amanda Delisio from York University, Philippa King, Director of It's a Penalty, and Mike Duignan from University of Surrey. Just briefly, I want to introduce their CVs, and please refer to the documents that are available on site if you're interested in contact details or if anything matters in relation to the work they have done. So Amanda is a researcher from York University, and her research is focused on urban and health inequities in mega sport event host cities. Philippa King is the director of the Student Ambassadors Network program and the campaign director for FIFA World Cup Qatar 2022. She's a mentor to students and delivers activist projects that raise awareness to help prevent modern slavery, exploitation, and other issues. Mike is a good friend and colleague from University of Surrey, where he's also the director of the Observatory for Human Rights in Major Events. Furthermore, he's the editor of Event Management, a leading peer-reviewed journal for the study and analysis of events and festivals. And I want to start out with an opening question. And in the second round, I want to have an open discussion. So feel free to uh, post any comments that you would like to give or any questions that you may want to ask. My first question as an opening of the discussion would be, in what way can sport events be planned and delivered to minimize the effects of human trafficking and sex work? And we said that we'll talk about some language issues and discriminants between different definitions that are useful. And we agreed that Amanda will start out, and then Philippa will give a comment, and finally, Mike will make a statement. So please, Amanda, go ahead. How can sport events be planned and delivered to minimize the effects of human trafficking and sex work? And maybe you can put some definition statements in the very beginning first to make clear what we talk about.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I do just want to start by saying that I'm not in favor of mitigating sex work in the games. I think that the entrepreneurial activities of local women and gender diverse people involved in the host event should not be mitigated in the same way that, or not be, morally penalized. Especially when we see people involved in construction and the development of host cities taking on very entrepreneurial processes and being celebrated for that. So I do want to distinguish that human trafficking and sex work are two separate issues. And in line with that, and in response to the question, I also want to acknowledge that there's really no single trafficking story. There are certainly patterns that involve opportunistic personalities that target always already the most vulnerable sectors of society, people in society, and that most often these opportunistic tendencies only further leverage and contribute to factors of vulnerability. In terms of my own positionality, I also just want to start by saying that I'm joining this panel as a researcher activist involved in projects with migrant and sex worker rights organizations, particularly in Rio de Janeiro and Toronto. And I'm interested in feminist solidarities that are created in response to state abandonment and crises of late capitalism. And this research has continually demonstrated that there's three kind of key problems with the human trafficking hype that has joined the convoy or caravan that is the sport mega event circus. So first, the first kind of key problem with mitigating human trafficking at the event, although again, I'm not a proponent of human trafficking in no means. I don't think there's many people that would say that they are, and which is why it's politically very advantageous and used in unique ways. But one of the first key problems is that there's so much condensed under this term trafficking, under this umbrella of trafficking. And it's really difficult, particularly in looking at the laws and local contexts of host cities, to know explicitly what trafficking is. There continues to be a big public appetite with respect to combating human trafficking, and rightfully so. And millions is spent in charitable efforts to address this huge range of complex concerns. But again, because there is no single story, Actually each type of labor exploitation or coercion or deception involved in labor and working conditions really require multi-level and unique interventions at these different levels, right? So we can't really, we tend to collapse them all into this umbrella of human trafficking, but that doesn't really allow to work with the nuances of what's involved with people with precarious status, for example, or people that are already involved in gendered-based violence in their own unique ways. Second, the dominant public understanding of trafficking, one that we often see as sensationalized stories of women and children forced into prostitution. I mean, I'm sure you've all seen Taken or a movie similar. These are very familiar plots and narratives that are highly dramatized. They don't always always or often paint pictures that actually match the real stories. Stories of human trafficking, not only sexual trafficking, but human trafficking in athletic apparel and equipment manufacturing and stadia construction and in young athlete recruitment are hardly or rarely kind of acknowledged in these dominant stories. And what these stories do is kind of reproduce policing operations that are aimed at rescuing victims and going after perpetuating criminals. And these stories are picked up by the media and are, very favorably played out in the media. And so they become mutually reinforcing and very politically advantageous. Again, as I've said from the beginning, I'm not a proponent of trafficking. I also don't think any side of the political aisle, regardless of where the host city is or where the sport mega event is hosted, would be a proponent of trafficking, right? So it's very difficult to come out against some of these anti-trafficking efforts, particularly when you're seeing them played out in local communities, which is what I've dedicated my work to, which is working with people that are harmed by these narratives. So you see a groundswell of public support and a huge public expenditure spent on policing, rather than really addressing the reasons why people from marginalized communities are vulnerable to coercion and exploitation in the labor environment. And the third and last kind of big problem with this kind of human trafficking hype that has jumped on this mega event circus is that it becomes necessary in a way, or a function of the efforts to speak for people involved in informal, semi-legal, and income-generating activities as trafficking victims. There's no other way that they're kind of publicly accepted other than to be a victim of trafficking. And so to bring public attention to the kind of very, unfavorable labor and working conditions that people are experiencing, there's always a lot of support for trafficking survivors. But the same level of public support is not, we don't see this globally in terms of responses to poverty or homelessness or even LGBTQ plus youth in cities. So for all of those as examples of the things that would really kind of prevent the kind of coerced labor that we see in tandem with the sport event. So instead, what we see is sex workers being treated as scapegoats for societal collapse, akin to that which we observed with HIV and the AIDS epidemic. Sex workers as being scapegoats and a rationale for governments to not responding to, or international conglomerates like FIFA and the IOC to not responding to the kind of egregious labor conditions that we see people working in global and geopolitical unequal societies. And they foster a charitable mindset rather than one of justice, which is what I've kind of been continuing to unpack with my work. And what I mean by that is a charitable mindset instead of one dedicated to justice is that the changing conditions, there's not much a focus on changing the conditions of people that are living within these realities, even listening to and recognizing the nuances of these realities. And instead, you kind of create these economies of alleged care that become very profitable with the games. I mean, there's so much money invested into the global human trafficking charities and campaigns. We just don't see the same kind of attention toward addressing kind of the inequities that push people into these inhumane labor conditions. So in summary, and more directly to respond to your question, talking about trafficking is often the only avenue for marginalized communities and migrant communities to get mainstream media attention. And of course, as a victim, I mean, it's similar to being a criminal. You have no rights, you have no voice. As a victim, someone speaks on your behalf as opposed to you being able to speak on your own behalf. And seldom do you see that the kind of survivor or support offered really allow people to escape the conditions in which they're living in, and in fact allows for, you know, the perpetuation of profit and a continual circulation of these economies of alleged care. So I'll stop there, and I'm really interested to see where the conversation goes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Amanda. I want to pass on the torch to Philippa, please.
Thank you, George, and thank you, Amanda. And yeah, I agree. I think that, you know, there's a huge conflation between human trafficking and sex work, and actually that is not the case. And as you said, there's so many different typologies of human trafficking, and sexual exploitation is one of those. I think, you know, we've worked since 2014, since the FIFA World Cup in Rio, and done 12 campaigns around major sporting events. And you know, because human trafficking by its very nature is illegal, getting actually, you know, data on the uptick of it is very, very difficult to do. So I think, again, we have to be very careful about how we say that. And I think also sometimes media reports draw attention to the ongoing problem of human trafficking or exploitation in a city when the major sporting event is there. But to be clear, human trafficking happens in every country in the world throughout the year, day in, day out. There's like over 40 million people that are being exploited. And it's the second largest criminal industry in the world. But through our campaigns, we have seen a correlation and an uptick of instances or people reporting to the hotlines, and, you know, survivors being rescued and rehabilitated from being exploited. And again, I think going back to the demand for commercial sex, traffickers by their very nature are opportunistic. And unfortunately, they see the influx of hundreds of thousands of people sometimes to host cities, with the knowledge that people will look for sex work to actually be an opportunity for them. And, you know, there is case studies of women that have been moved from one host city to another to actually be sexually exploited. But again, after every event is over, the level of the activity in the sex market will go back to what they were. And it's very important not to, to cause harm to sex workers at the same time. So I think there are identifiable risks. I think, you know, there is a place for campaigns to be had. We know that between 20% and 160% of increase in reports. And particularly how we work is actually we train taxi drivers, Uber hosts, and hoteliers to actually know the signs of exploitation. And of course, that's something that will be long lasting after the event is gone. I think it's also really important to say that in each country, how you talk about human trafficking will be contextualized in a different way. So in America, around the Super Bowl campaigns, it's very much on the sexual exploitation front. But for instance, in Japan, that was the beginning at the Tokyo Olympics. That was at the beginning of a conversation around actually child exploitation, and for people to actually, you know, start having that discourse socially. So, yeah, it's a very complex and nuanced space.
Thank you very much, Philippa. Mike, please go ahead.
Yeah, it's actually quite difficult to add on in terms of how complex and multi-scale this problem is, particularly when it comes around to the point that Philippa has just made in terms of every context and every case is just so fundamentally different. And it's really difficult to kind of compare and contrast cases because events are kind of like mobile states. They fly in between different contexts and cases that all have their different social systems and norms and values. And it's a very difficult problem for lots of different ways. And I think in terms of what Philippa said, in terms of the absence of data and evidence, that's a particular problem that we'd be looking at. And that's the angle that really I come at it, really, which is that, you know, we really don't know a huge amount. If you look into the literature in comparison with other problems, we don't really know a lot about the extent of the problem. So, both the demand side and the supply side, there's still so much to be kind of understood, characterized, and evidenced as part of this. So there's a long way to go, but there are still quite a lot of skeptics somehow on a global scale that still kind of question whether, for example, at the Super Bowl there are issues of trafficking going on and that sort of thing. I've seen news reports, papers, spoke to police chiefs in the UK that vehemently denied that there is a strong link. So that's a problem in itself. So that's an issue with data and evidence and that sort of thing. One of the problems lies in the fact that events and festivals and our leisure industry just generally is not home, it's not work, it's a space where fun, frivolity and hedonism is supposed to exist. And lots of people have argued why we're less inclined to critique these kinds of spaces, kind of less so than home, like domestic abuse, or work, like discrimination, irrespective really at how unsavory we see things. And I really say this because we do need more comprehensive research, evidence, and reporting and dissemination of the problem. Daniela mentioned that we've got a problem of many hands. And it is about kind of trying to coordinate what is really a cacophony of well-meaning but very much disorganized stakeholders to expose the scale of this problem. We're talking about owners of events, organizers, governments, public authorities, law enforcement, universities, researchers, and students, of which I can see Eliz, one of my students, in the room. And we do have that shared responsibility. That's the reason why event rights plays a massive role in this. So, for example, on the demand side, it's really about understanding who, when, where, why, how those that fuel the problem of trafficking exacerbate the issue by demanding it, for example. So let's take illegal sexual exploitation. So there's a piece of work that we're doing to examine the search behaviors of those who demand sex in big events. Over the last decade, we've looked at the periods leading up to, during, and afterwards to see, for example, when the problem arises in this immediate stage and what we can do about it. And I think that it is really up to people like Andreas and his counterparts in these organizations to use their legal superpowers. Again, Daniela was talking about the legal enforcements that happen at the host city contract level, to, for example, switch on safe search within X amount of radius and X time of people coming into the destination. Because as Philippa said, there's really a direct link between inbound tourists coming in and demanding hedonistic experiences. And one of those is the demand for sex. And we can very much see that in lots of cases. So there's a mix of lots of different hard and soft approaches to this. But research and data is key because really, I think there's still a lot of people that distrust the facts and the validity of a lot of the claims that we're trying to make. This really leads to an ignorance of the scale of the problem. Mega events have been critiqued for decades for this. There really are fantasy lands in a way, and we fantasize about them just as much as what they can do for us, and really what they don't do to others in return for that fantasy that they give to us. So really, fantasies just emerge between the truth, myth, and lie, really. And in a way, events constantly gaslight communities, thinking that they're good, but actually there's a lot of bad that we need to tackle. So, like any other places whereby our attention is diverted, we must always look at the little things. The poor pay, the backgrounds of those exploited, the conditions, the family upheaval, the things that constitute modern day slavery as an example of trafficking. Oh, and the 6,500 deaths since Qatar won the right to host. So there's a lot of bits of evidence that we need to piece together, and we all need to come together, really. So I think that we really do need to produce a very, very comprehensive data analysis approach. But on the bright side, events are bat signals. The Commissioner Gordon of the mega event world, let's just call it Andreas, alerts of the dangers, actual and potential, real and perceived, and the world shines a light back on that context and see what crawls out of the subterfuge. So we really do need these spectacles to illustrate these problems going on, not only just induced by the event, but happening on an everyday level. Because I believe a conversation that I had with Philippa once, that's human trafficking, 99% of it exists really on an everyday level. The event actually can be used as a leverageable resource to do something about it. So I would personally rather reveal the truth instead of being really enthralled to a lie and sweep it under the carpet. And I think that that's the beauty of events, really whatever the cost is to our effective integrity, really. And then I've got a few solutions, but I'll talk about them a little bit later.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Mike. Amanda, Philippa, do you want to directly respond to some of the comments that Mike or that you made, maybe in direction towards solutions or what you termed in terms of stakeholder engagement and where the stakeholders needs to be pressured from a legal, political perspective?
I think one of the reflections I have, which both Amanda and Mike said, is about around the complexities of human trafficking and around the myths surrounding it, because human trafficking, modern slavery, happens in your city where you are, where the event is happening. And I think, people do have this idea that it's like Taken with Liam Neeson, girl on holiday in Paris, taken away to another country. That may happen once in a, goodness knows how many cases, but it's actually a lot more the coercion and this deception around it. And lots of actually people don't realise that they are a victim. It's just a norm for them. So again, going back to the campaigns, I think it's really important to actually speak not just to the public, but actually to speak to people that it may be happening to, so that you actually, you're not taking their voice away, and you're giving that information to them. So that was just one of my reflections on the discussion that's been had so far.
Yeah, thank you very much, Philippa. Amanda, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think I would just comment on the myth around the demand. I think after speaking with over 100 women involved in sex work in Rio de Janeiro in 4 different districts of the city, closest to where the event was taking place, closest to the FIFA fan zones and the Olympic zones, the large response was that there was never this demand that was imagined, right? They were very optimistic that in fact there would be this influx of tourism and tourists would come and be spending money. This is for sex work specifically, adult consensual sex work. And those fantasies never materialized either. And so I think that's but what did in fact materialize was a number of women were displaced from their businesses because of event construction. And so they needed to relocate and find quick solutions at a time when they were really hopeful and optimistic for the kind of economic opportunities that the games would bring. And that is just something that I see continually perpetuated. But again, that wasn't unique in my research or the work that we did with the Observatory and Davide, the sex workers' rights organization in Brazil, and throughout Brazil in the different host cities of FIFA. But it has been found since 2011 in the GATT, the Global Alliance of Anti-Trafficking. There's been a report that has said similar things. Since Germany, 2006, where there was this fear of 40,000 trafficking victims being, brought into the city for FIFA fans, these things just never materialized, and yet they continue to circulate. And so, I just wanted to address the fact that although there is, even from the women and gender diverse people working in sex work that are very optimistic for that demand, it's not a material reality.
Yeah, thank you very much, Amanda. So Mike, on what levels do the solutions need to be in the end if we want to work out how do we deal with it? I mean, a lot of comments have been made that this is day-to-day practice, right? So, I mean, do we need special solutions for events at all, or how do you perceive that?
Yeah, it goes back to Amanda's point. Every aspect of trafficking has its own particular unique requirement and solution. But I think that just building on what Andrea said earlier in terms of the deployment of personnel on the ground sounds very interesting. Ratting out, reporting, and focusing on the enforcement issue that we said was an absence is key. We obviously need more of it. and we need more of that data to come into the reporting. But Andreas talks about really this enforcement being fairly isolated in and around the event, and I personally think that we need enforcement throughout the entire protracted planning stages and delivery stages as well. So there's a need, to do something when the cameras aren't rolling, is important. I think educational campaigns, like I'm sure Philippa might talk about, in terms of what It's a Penalty does in terms of educating visitor economy staff, people in hotels, Uber, and leaving a legacy of what are the signs of human trafficking and how they can do something about it and report it. That's obviously key. I won't go into too much detail. I don't want to take away from what Philippa might talk about. I think AI has a massive part to play. We're working on a European bid with It's a Penalty to look at digital technological solutions. So fundamentally, we're going to see an absence of key gatekeepers over the next decade. Hotel self-check-ins, Uber, driverless cars. There's much less human interaction that we're going to see, and that ultimately means there's less eyes on the issues and reporting and spotting out for those signs. So we need to think about how AI in these particular leisure spaces can play a part. I think we need to report a lot more and recruit a lot more qualified supporters. If we could hire 1,000 Louis Theroux's or critical documentary makers or people from Vox or Vice that are critical investigative journalists as part of the data collection and evidence, that would be fantastic. And I think this is really important, to improve the amount of compassion and perhaps empathy that we have for the people that are affected. I think we need to really connect the theory of the problem to the faces that must really endure it, and whose lives are destroyed, and in some cases, like Qatar and various other instances, are taken away, really. And I think that universities plays a massive part, as well as all the other stakeholders that I mentioned. And this is really one of the reasons why activists and activists are angry about this, because they essentially possess a truth that not enough people, or perhaps the right ones, are listening to. And so therefore we need to connect the theory and the problem together with the practice and do more data evidence. That's where I would come naturally as a researcher, but I welcome any thoughts on that.
I actually have a thought on that. I think there's a massive problem with putting more power with enforcement and authorities that already hold much power in these respects. I think in talking to the actual workers that are affected by these enforcement strategies, in many cases, that's exactly where the corruption will take place. So, men asking for sexual favors to avoid illegal enforcement or criminalizing. We talk about sex work as being legal, but it's really not. It's semi-legal. The act of selling your body for sex is legal, but every single activity around it is illegal. And that varies from host country. But in the countries that I've worked most closely with, which is Brazil and in Canada, even communicating for the purposes of your profession is illegal. Talking about what you do or talking to someone about what you do, organizing with an association or a workers collective is illegal. 2 women, there's been so many cases, but as an example, 2 women that were renting an apartment consensually, again, renting it for themselves, working individually, independently, were charged with exploiting each other. And we see cases of this happening all the time. So I think putting the power back in the workers, and if there is such an influx of resources that are available, there's already organizing happening at a local level. There's places like Casanem in the case of Rio de Janeiro, which was the Pride House, but also a trans occupation site where many sex workers and trans individuals lived and organized politically. There's places like literal brick and mortar places like that. There's sex worker organizations. I worked with one national one, but there's so many other ones in different fractions within different host cities, from the Amazon to Sao Paulo to Rio de Janeiro. These people are already organized. And so putting more power and resources into the local community, the people that are most targeted from anti-trafficking efforts, and saying, what do you want to do about it? And instead of saying, let's put the power back in enforcement with police or local authorities, or even using surveillance technologies to monitor their activities, is something that I would just be very cautious about putting forward as a solution, because I think the workers are already thinking and strategizing and are often one step ahead of what's happening, but are also very harmed by enforcement tactics. So my solution would be concentrating on where people are already organized, and organizing with those that are organized at a local level to address the problems that we allege to want to help, right? So we allege to want to dismantle unequal labor conditions. Then let's go to the women that are experiencing those. How can we empower them at work and in their workplaces, as opposed to adding a new layer of legality to what they're already doing?
I think education is the key. So and then hopefully that will, impact, societal and behaviour change in the long term. But there are so many myths and misconceptions around human trafficking and exploitation. And there's a couple of examples actually around major sporting events. So at the London 2012 Olympics, in the athletes' village after the games had gone, some of the cleaners there were actually criminally coerced, to go into each of the athletes' room and take away all of the TV sets from criminal gangs. And then at the Commonwealth Games, we know that they've been training all their security staff, but the security staff have no training on what human trafficking could look like in supply chains or cleaners or other people in the thing. So I think it's a really long-term attitudinal change that we're looking at. And, I think, there's that old adage, you don't know what you don't know. So, but it is looking at, at the long-term solutions, and, actually talking to the people that are affected by it, as Amanda said, and, what is their voice? What would they like to change? How would, they like to see things different? And it does go back to structural issues. The people that are preyed on are the vulnerable. They're those that are living in poverty or coming out of conflict zones. There's many media reports around how traffickers have targeted, refugees coming out of Ukraine. It happens in all conflict zones. So yeah, looking at that structural level, and again on the legal level, there was a law change of child marriage in India, to try and address domestic servitude, but until attitudes change, that's actually not going to, get much traction, because actually what's happening now is some people are changing birth certificates so that their children still can get married. So what we do at It's a Penalty, with that's key to us, is the training with the sort of strategic travel and tourism actors that are in major sporting events. And by training Uber drivers, there was an Uber driver that we trained in 2018, I think it was in the Atlanta Super Bowl, and we heard last year that because of his training, he actually help somebody get out of an exploited situation that he was asked to take from one hotel to another. So I think it's, if it's even that one person that can be saved, then, taken to a place where they can start to, you never overcome it, but start to rebuild, then I think that's something. So education, I think, is really important. And the understanding that actually lots of people that are being exploited don't even realise they're being exploited, and so to start unpacking all of that as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Philippa. Amanda, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, just to add to the educational piece, I think one of the things that I've been really encouraged in Toronto now, what I'm seeing in terms of campaigns around human trafficking is in respect to education, is putting political education in workplaces. So despite what language people are speaking, have translated laws on the workplace walls so that people are able to access that at their workplace and see, what are my rights here? What can and can I not do? Is it legal for me to lock the door when I've been told that it's actually illegal for me to lock it? So that they're aware politically and about the existing laws, and what they, if they are a newcomer into a city and working in these informal, semi-legal sectors, that they're aware of their rights. And so making that information accessible and translating that and having it available at workplaces, I think, is a part of the educational component. But again, you can only know what a person doesn't know by working with them, and working with workers to say, like, you know, in the case of Toronto, I mean, there's an entire legal team that's involved in these one-page briefers that are shared on doors, so and workspaces. So I think the educational component is especially important at the level of the worker that might not be aware that what they're being asked is in fact illegal.
Yeah, thank you very much. You both mentioned this attitudinal change in stakeholders, like the drivers that bring workers, or the hotel persons responsible at the hotels. Can you describe a little bit what the attitude is that you want to see in the people? Because attitude is always saying, okay, I like something, I don't like something. So what is the evaluative component of like the attitude or the change in attitude that you want to see? Can you describe it a little bit?
Yeah, I'm happy to attempt to do that, George. So we've also got a program where we're training students in the UK, and so and there's training all around the different types of human trafficking, modern slavery, but also supporting them to become activists. So, for instance, so the attitude is, so for instance, in the UK, there's lots of foreign students that come into universities, but and obviously they have visa rules in terms of what time they can work or not, but they're actually not really aware of what their rights are when they end university. And so there's been lots of instances of them being exploited in care homes and coerced into that, and in debt bondage for so-called recruiters. So I think for me, it's that, like that we should all care, that we should all actually be aware of what can happen to somebody else, and if we spot it, don't be a bystander. Actually, try and interact in a safe way for them, and ultimately that actually, that this is just not acceptable in society. So whether that's advocating towards governments for policy change, or whether it's working with communities to try to decrease their vulnerabilities, whether it's working with law enforcers not to victimize victims, the gamut is quite wide, but actually, try and make that change yourself, and yeah, not just be a bystander in life, I think.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Philippa. Mike, do you want to make a concluding statement? I look at the time because David wants to make a final statement too and close at 6. So maybe, Mike, you can have a final statement on this session, and then I will thank you all and lead over to David, who also wants to have 2 more minutes at the very end.
Yeah. No, it's in terms of the attitudinal change. I think that's not just, it really goes back to my previous point around whose responsibility is it, and I think that repeatedly you see that the event owners have been absolving themselves of responsibility for what happens in the host context. And I think that in terms of the attitudinal change, I think that there's still a lot to be done in terms of whose responsibility is it, whether that's, like Philippa said, in terms of kind of the perspectives of students and understanding their rights, right through to the event owners and organizers. I think that it's such a challenging problem, and I think that we need to be very, very careful to not provide generic solutions to very specific problems and specific contexts. And I think that there needs to be more effort on the ground to contextualize the problem and come up with solutions that fit that context. And that's probably, without going back into the detail of this, that's probably where we suffer the most, given that these events are like mobile states. They do roam, and before the fog of war is over, it's kind of lost and forgotten, and the battle's already lost, and there's still a lot to be done in that protracted planning stage, really. And I can only applaud what Amanda's been doing. It's so interesting and so impactful, and the same for Philippa in terms of the campaign work and the right through to educating visitors at airports and airplanes and in hotels and Uber cabs, right through to right through to making structural changes in terms of leaving a longer term educational legacy. I think that the problem's complicated, like Amanda says, but I think there's a lot more effort that's been put in to tackle the issues. I think it's in many cases a legal issue and regulatory issue that people like Andreas need to take much more seriously and take ownership of the problem and set, as he said at the very beginning of his talk, set new international norms. So the local level and the events and the particular host level can align to those. And I think that mega events, as we've seen, can be beacons of massive social change. And I think that this is just illustrative, but there's so far to go. But just the fact that we're all in here in the same room, and the fact that Andreas is here and various other people are just testament to where we've come and where we've got to go, really. So.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. Thank you, Amanda and Philippa.